Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us is the associate editor of Strategy Page, columnist and author Austin Bay.
Welcome, Austin and Jim. A lot of things are brewing with Russia right now, and there's a lot brewing up in the Baltic. Everyone's focused on Ukraine, Jim, but there are things happening up in the Baltic that have Sweden concerned, correct?
Yeah, Sweden is still not part of NATO, but more than ever in the past, they are, functionally part of NATO, much like France was after they quit NATO in the 1960s and became more and more of an unofficial member. The Swedes realized that they are one of the more exposed nations to Russian aggression. Of course, the problem the Russians have, which I think a lot of the NATO countries and the Swedes are realizing, is that they cannot deploy a lot of combat-ready brigades at one time because half of the Russian troops are conscripts who serve for 1 year. Now, that means your combat brigades have, how should I put it, a large percentage of conscripts, and most of them are not trained, for combat operations. So, they may have, 20 or so brigades surrounding Ukraine, but not all those brigades are combat capable. Now, a lot of Western observers, pundits, are playing that down or aren't even aware of the situation with the percentage of conscripts and their level of training. The Russians have also been trying to build up a reserve system, but that isn't working yet. It was their reserve system during the Cold War that made them such a formidable force that could muster in short notice, 170 divisions. Well, that's gone. And because the Russian people, now they have more of a say, and despite efforts to control the state media, including the internet, which have not been wholly successful, anytime a Russian conscript gets killed overseas or outside the country, and that includes Ukraine, the family, basically reports on the internet, oh, poor, I even came back dead, in a body bag, and he wasn't in Syria and he wasn't in Libya, so where was he? Well, obviously, he was in Ukraine, where there are technically no Russian troops. That's something else that's been played down. The separatists, so to speak, the rebels, I call them, in eastern Ukraine, are now largely non-Ukrainian. Or in other words, they're mercenaries. The Russians brought in a lot of volunteer units, including some Cossacks. The Cossacks are making a comeback. They were basically banned during the Cold War. And various nationalist groups, but these are all Russian. And the Ukrainians, and again, we follow this in Strategy Page on a regular basis, the Ukrainians are constantly catching Russians. They know what a Russian sounds like on the radio. We've been helping them with, radio communications, especially electronic warfare, because the Russians have been trying out all their new stuff to try and disrupt the Ukrainian communications. But the Ukrainians report, my God, there's a lot of Russians over there. And what they do is they come in wearing uniforms with no symbols on them, but they're basically Russians. So technically, they're not pretending to be Ukrainian troops or, separatist troops, but they're not hiding the fact that they're Russian. So all they have to do is open their mouth and say something. So all this is basically ignored or played down. But in combat, if there were to be a fight in Ukraine, it would all be very relevant, because if you send any of these brigades in with conscripts in them and they start getting killed, and by the way, this hasn't been covered a lot. The Ukrainians have been preparing for this invasion for 7 years now. Since 2014, they've increased their special operations forces. They've organized reserves, and they've had plenty of volunteers. They arm them. And they are all aware of the fact that the Russians cannot afford to lose conscripts fighting in foreign war And despite Russia saying, well, Ukraine really isn't a foreign war, they're really part of Russia. But see, that's another thing that gets overlooked. The Russians signed a treaty in 1994 that in return for Ukraine giving up its nukes, the ones it inherited when the Soviet Union dissolved, everybody got to keep whatever Russian, equipment was in their territory. And two of those countries, I think it was Kazakhstan and Ukraine, inherited lots of nukes. The Russians were basically willing to guarantee in writing that they would never try and take any Ukrainian territory in return for the Ukrainians giving up their nukes. And of course, the United States paying for, dismantling them and rendering them into power plant fuel. So, this doesn't get as much attention as it should, because it means the Ukrainians do not trust the Russians at all. They also understand the Russian weaknesses, which the Russians play down. They say, oh, we have 100,000, 150,000 troops freezing their butts off in the relatively tropical winters of Ukraine. But they really cannot afford to invade. If they do, it becomes a catastrophe of unknown proportions as far as the Russians are concerned. They don't like that kind of uncertainty. So Putin is basically playing a scare game. They feel they have a weak American president this time around, as opposed to, before 2020. And they can bully this guy. And, that may or may not be true. Our president has misspoke, so to speak, several times, indicating that, we would let Russia grab a part of Ukraine. That's not true. But now I think the NATO, our NATO allies, especially the Eastern European ones, the Poles in particular, and the Baltic states, are basically saying, look, you hung us out to dry in 1940, in 1939. The whole point of joining NATO was to ensure that that doesn't happen again. And that's the reason why the Ukrainians want to join NATO. Before 2014, a minority, 20% maybe, of Ukrainians who were saying, yeah, we should join NATO. But with that, they had that 1994 treaty. Say, look, by treaty, the Russians can't try and take our territory. After 2014, the percentage wanting to join NATO went up to over 70%. So do the math.
Austin?
Yeah, you wanted to talk about the Baltics. I was going to make a comment when Jim was discussing Sweden's situation. One of the reasons that Sweden feels threatened is because they look at the local geography, and Russia, in order to get out of St. Petersburg, and really even to get out of their big base, their exclave at Kaliningrad, they have to pass through, of course, the eastern Baltic, and there's so many Swedish islands out there. I mean, there's the Danish island of Bornholm that everybody except the Danes and Russians and Nordics forget about, which is a big, huge piece of rock and a major NATO intelligence asset, given all the electronic surveillance material that's on that equipment that's on that island. But there's so many Swedish islands. During the Cold War, the Russians were always playing submarine games and Spetsnaz games among the various islands that Sweden has, and the Swedes would catch them occasionally. Why? It's because the Russians, if they were going to have to, quote unquote, break out in a war, they were going to come through there, and the Swedes were certain that if a war broke out during the Cold War went hot, that you'd have Russian troops on those islands, seizing those islands. Now I'm going to leap ahead just for a second. That's why one of the major exercises that Sweden has had in the last, Jim, you might correct me on this, it's now 2022. I think they did it in 2018. So 3.5 years, I guess, ago, was a rapid defense exercise that even involved some counterattack on a quote unquote enemy seizure of one of the islands that's one of the major islands offshore. NATO had not only observers in that, but if I remember correctly, at least 2 NATO nations participated in it. And there's always NATO aircraft that have been, I say always, but they've been participating openly since Russia seized the Crimean Peninsula in February, March of 2014. So that's Jim's right about focusing on Sweden is anything but a neutral when it comes to seeing what they do militarily and what they have, the way they have structured their defenses. Now, another comment, Jim says they behave like France after de Gaulle. Actually, what France did was withdraw, quote unquote, from the military side of NATO. It never withdrew from NATO, but that was a fraud. I in the mid 70s, when I was on active duty in Germany, 1, 2, 3, 4 different exercises that I can recall involving French troops, including one was a major command post map exercise, but it involved 2 French armored divisions. Well, they were mechanized infantry divisions. They're moving around on paper, but the French were playing in it. But there were all kinds of training exercises that maybe it might be at small levels, company-sized exercises. But they went on, and the French and at least one reforger I participated in provided 250 commandos. We were playing the bad guys. The unit I was in, we were structured to appear as a Soviet Guards armored army, even though we were just a heavily reinforced division. But our Spetsnaz capability was supplied by 250 French commandos who jumped in about 36 hours before the war game kicked off, and were running surveillance operations against the quote unquote NATO good guys of U.S. forces and Bundeswehr forces. So that's direct participation, but as Jim said, they were trying to hide it and playing, the we're different card that the French played. They knew who the enemy was. It was the Russians. Same thing going on up in the Nordic, and you say in the Baltic area. We can talk about the vulnerability of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. I mean, Stalin overran them, and in 1940, as he was rebuilding the old Romanov Empire. But now they're members of NATO, and they've got Article 5, the Three Musketeers clause, that if you're attacked, it's supposed to be one for all and all for one. Jim's already pointed out that Ukraine doesn't benefit from that. If you like, I can talk a little bit about some thoughts that I had in 2012 and 2013 about Ukraine and NATO. But look at Finland. Finland is not in NATO either. But we've had exercises in the last 3 years with U.S., Swedish, Norwegian, German participation. And the Finns, supposedly neutral, when they had been Finlandized by Russia. But you looked at their defenses, you look at the way that they built their reserve system, where, and essentially, well, Jim, what is it? They could create an 800, 900,000 man army in 36 to 72 hours out of their reserves. I think that's the right, out of, maybe it's very similar to what the Israelis can pull off. And then they've got highly defensible terrain along the Russian border. There's a substantial number of Finns, and it may well be over 50% that want to join NATO. Let's just get rid of this, seeming that we're independent and neutral, because we're not. We exercise with Norwegians all the time. and we exercise with the Danes all the time. And the truth is, the Danes have, and part of it is the ability is using Bornholm, but also their own facilities on the Jutland Peninsula. They basically provide the air control for Northern Army Group, for the northern flank of NATO, and they've been providing that air control to the Swedes and Finns for decades, providing them. This is what we see, and then they through Denmark, NATO information on Russian air activity, Soviet air activity, Russian air activities transferred to Sweden and Finland. I read an article about maybe a year ago with an interview that included an interview with a couple of Swedish pilots that were talking about doing some of this back in the 70s. And they felt, well, we can talk about it. Everybody in the Swedish Air Force knows we were doing it. And just, thank you for the information. Of course, what was about was still defending Sweden, which is why, as Jim pointed out, a lot of Swedes are thinking, let's just drop the facade and formally join NATO because you get the Article 5 benefit. So why this has happened is all has happened, not all of it, obviously, the roots are deep, but the surfacing happens after the invasion and annexation of Crimea in 2014. And Putin outright coming and saying, he's trying to recreate the old Soviet empire, a new Russian empire. And the Baltic nations and the Nordics know that Finland was part of the Romanov Empire, the Grand Duchy of Finland, or whatever it was. They don't want to be part of a Russian empire. I'll go ahead and make the comment about Ukraine and NATO. I wrote a piece, an essay, I think it was in 2013, where I said I did not think Ukraine was ready to join NATO. You could have that, partnership for peace type agreement, which we used as a route for Macedonia, Albania to join NATO. They went through that partnership for peace process. Montenegro as well, because they did. For one thing, is they didn't meet the military qualifications, and they didn't have the kind of organization and background to function as a contributing NATO force. So there was a growth process, and I thought in that essay, I said, okay, that might work, but I also thought that I didn't see the will on the part of major NATO nations, including us, Germany, France, Great Britain, to defend Ukraine. Jim also pointed out, and that's the 1994 Budapest Agreement, that supposedly Ukraine had been granted by the Russians, had agreed to their territorial integrity in exchange for the nukes. And it looked like it, no matter what Putin was saying, that was a good agreement. Of course, it wasn't. Within a year or so after I wrote that, you have the Crimean invasion and the annexation of Crimea and incorporating it into Putin's reviving Russian empire. But that still was, when I wrote that, I was thinking, really, are we going to do this? Article 5 going to apply to Ukraine with all of its internal problems? I don't know. Remember what's going on, and also in 2013, you still have, as you still have it ongoing now, all the chaos in Syria, and Turkey was even in 2011 talking about invoking Article 5 because some of Assad's soldiers had fired shots, mortar rounds, and across the border in southern Turkey. Erdogan used that as a way to scare the Assads that they were suddenly going to war with the United States and Germany and everyone else. He threatened to do it, and there wasn't a lot of interest in NATO and defending. It's not that it wasn't a legitimate appeal, but maybe we shouldn't take on something we're not ready to take on. But now you see what the way that Putin has preyed upon them. Jim doesn't think they're going to pull the trigger. I mean, the Russians, despite all the posturing, I don't either. As a matter of fact, I wrote that, I think, about 6 weeks ago. So a lot of this is posturing, but it could happen. It could happen, and you'd have a fait accompli. And how much do they get? I don't know, but I know that one thing they look at very much is that port, Mariupol.
Yeah.
That's it, because they want a land route to Crimea. So, Dan, you want to talk about the Baltics? It comes down to what's Russia's bad behavior has actually hardened attitudes in Sweden and Finland about being active for their own defense and finally cooperating with who their real friends are, which is NATO.
Jim, what has stirred up the Russians? I mean, really, they say that it's that NATO is encroaching on them, right? But what has really got them stirred up?
Financial problems. Remember back in 2013, 2014, two major things happened. The price of oil, world price of oil went down from over $100 a barrel to about $30 a barrel. Russia is highly dependent upon oil exports, and as well as natural gas. And suddenly they had much less money. Putin was, basically considering how he could, how should I put it, expand his financial prospects. And he looked around and he realized that, well, there's Ukraine, there's Central Asian, the Stans, which have oil and natural gas. There's Azerbaijan, which they have to treat very gingerly because the Iranians also have, designs on Azerbaijan. That's a whole other story. And for reasons that seemed inexplicable at the time, he suddenly decided that NATO was at war with Russia. They were encroaching. And what was encroaching was he did the math and realized that if he threatened Ukraine, they would go pro-NATO. They thought that they were protected by that '94 treaty, which he didn't sign, but he, as the subsequent elected leader of Russia, he was bound by, and he certainly profited by. He could have had a nuclear Ukraine, which would have changed the math, considerably. So he had to justify all this aggression against what he called the near abroad. Now, the Swedes went and did an analysis, which they published, of what all the claims are in the short term and medium term for acquiring this new terrain. And it not only included initially parts of Ukraine, but also eventually all of Ukraine, as well as part of Poland up to the Vistula River. And the Russians didn't, talk about this openly as a threat, but the Swedes could read the Russian media, and a lot of it was, basically all you had to do is read Russian, and you could see what the plan was and what the claims were. And they decided, this guy Putin is dangerous. They also found out that before 2014, the Swedes had eliminated conscription, or in the way of doing that, and greatly reducing their armed forces, their Israeli-style, mobilization army. And it got to the point where in Gotland, that's a major island they had that blocks, Russian passage through the Baltic. They used to maintain a garrison with a couple of hundred, active duty troops and hundreds of reservists living on Gotland. So if there was a war, they'd immediately have a fairly substantial armed and trained force on Gotland to at least slow the Russians down before reinforcements could reach them. They have since then reinstituted conscription and discovered that there's not much resistance to conscription at the moment. The Swedish people said, "Ooh, we made a mistake. We we trusted the Russians. You don't do that. And all Putin had to do was, follow his obligations, and he would have had become stronger and stronger. But instead, he's made himself weaker and weaker. It's costing him a lot of money to try and maintain this more. Ultimately, he wants a volunteer army. But the army is only about a fifth of the size of the Soviet forces, and they had to cut the term of conscription. They try to keep the conscripts out of elite combat units, the Spetsnaz, the airborne, and what have you. But even there, they had to go back to the Cold War technique, where they would accept very eager and able volunteer conscripts to join these units. And that's a thing that's been going on, in the West for a long time. An educated fellow, I met a guy in basic who had just graduated from Harvard, and he was volunteering for airborne. And I said, why? He says, look, after I get out, I go to law school. I never get a chance to have any fun. Well, he didn't put it that way, but he said it's a once in a lifetime chance to basically do something, daring. And there are a lot more guys like that. That's why, during the Afghan and the Iraq wars, when there was complaints about, black and non-white soldiers are taking more of the casualties. Well, it wasn't true during Vietnam, and it was much less true during the wars from 2001 to where they basically calmed down after 2014. The majority of volunteers for the infantry were white guys. Again, like the Harvard grad, saying, well, hey, I got skills, I can get a job. And black soldiers who qualified to volunteer, they went for technical jobs. And I spoke to a couple of them when I was, when we were, giving talks or, working, so to speak, unofficially with the Army. Austin and I did some of that. And so I tested that hypothesis. And he says, yeah, he says, being in the infantry, no big deal. But he says, they really give you good training. And I can become an expert mechanic, aviation mechanic, jobs maintaining airliners, pays well, electronics technician and what have you. And it was basically a new opportunity for your average African American, volunteer. And that's how it played out. The news, for some reason, ignored that. But the volunteers, be they African American or otherwise, went after their own interests. And the white guys were saying, hey, yeah, let's go into combat. Because the other thing that did get much publicity was the rate of combat deaths during the after 2001 were less than half of what they were during Vietnam and World War II. And the reason for that was the units were much better trained, they were much better equipped, and there was much better medical care, especially on the battlefield. I think we just did another piece recently about the Platinum 10 minutes. During World War II, we realized there was the golden hour. If you got a badly wounded soldier back to a field hospital, within an hour, you could probably save him. But by the by 2010, 2012, we had trained medics to do what were in effect World War II level surgical procedures. We had developed medical field applications that could stop the bleeding. When the artery was severed and whatnot. This is the sort of stuff you just put on the wound and it would expand, and it would it would literally temporarily stop the bleeding. In places where you couldn't get a tourniquet, and that saved a lot of lives. And then we also realized, the National Guard guys who were on, the medic on the medevac, the helicopters. We looked at the Army, looked at the statistics. They loved their statistics, and they found out that when the guy on the medevac medical guy was a reservist, the survival rate was 60% higher. So they questioned these guys, and almost all of them had been EMTs in civilian life. So they not only had the training, they had years of experience. So the Army undertook a program to basically give more training to the volunteer medics, which basically added a year to their training. but they got up near the skill level of the veteran EMTs who had joined the National Guard. So there was all sorts of factors where it wasn't as deadly to go join the infantry, even though it got pretty deadly in Iraq because of the roadside bombs, and in Afghanistan because you were fighting the Afghans. They consider it a national sport. There's that anecdote which I was told by in the 1980s by two former officers with the with the pre 1979 Afghan army. They had trained in the Soviet Union, and they of course had gone over to the rebels. And one of them was standing in out of uniform in Kabul when the Russian mechanized units were rolling by, and he was next to this guy from the Hinders, the outback, as it were, a veteran, the guys who became Mujahideen. And he was saying, in Pashto, he says, look at all that loot. So they didn't fear the Russians. They saw them as a economic opportunity. So, we never adapted to that kind of fighting. And so, that's why we have the situation we have today. All these things are understandable if you look at the details. That's why our masthead says, the news as history. We always give the background, and the background always tells a different story than the the first pass that journalists with no historical background, not much experience either, have to make it. If it bleeds, it leads. So they look for whatever's bleeding and make up all sorts of reasons why. Oh, woes, we're doomed. But that's just the news media. That's their financial model. You can't really knock it. Otherwise, you'd have no independent media at all. But Russia thought, again, they played the psychological game. They realized that the longer the Ukrainians were threatened by, by Russia, the more we're going to, ask for joining NATO. Now, even before 2014, the Ukrainians had started, with that qualification process, which Austin described.
Partnership for peace.
Partnership
I
for peace.
think there was a wrinkle to it, though, Jim. They were going to be some sort of a special case, which I would say they were, but
But it changed after 2014. The Russians basically turned, Ukrainians is a pro-NATO. They were, they say, hey, look, we don't need it. It's we got to deal with the Russians. We're protected. Don't stir the bear up. He's finally tamed. He's on a leash. Well, he wasn't. He wasn't tamed, and he wasn't on a leash, and he's taking his muscle off. But the Russians still have inherent weaknesses. But now, they're trying to get in writing, we'll withdraw our troops who can't fight inside Ukraine and can't afford to take casualties. They don't never mention that. If you give us in writing a guarantee that you'll never let, Ukraine into NATO. Now, the United States or any other NATO member is not legally able to do that. But, Putin needed something to justify all this agita, all the expense. I mean, the two provinces in the Donbass, which historically were at one time Russian, were largely Russian. They brought in a lot of Russian workers during the Soviet period to work in the new industrial facilities, which have now been rendered useless. I mean, not by economics as well as all the fighting. But we reported, the incidents that most of the people in the Donbass quickly grew disillusioned with the Russians. And then we got the numbers from the Russians. It was costing them billions of dollars a year to support, the population in the Donbass. Same thing in the Crimea. They thought Crimea would, rally to the cause. Well, no, they didn't. They had the historical problems with the Tatars. They were the original, Ottoman, occupants, an ancient, Central Asian tribe, which had basically, taken control of it for centuries before. And, it's like the tar baby. The more you hit it, the more you get stuck to it. And that's what the Russians did to themselves in Ukraine. And now they're trying to back away. And he's trying to do that without losing a lot of, face, prestige, credibility with the Russian people, because they are getting pretty tired of Putin and his policies and the sanctions he's brought on them. Because, we report, and these are from Russian statistics, that the rate of poverty is now, it was before 2014. Putin, to his credit, had gotten it down to under 27% of the population. And these were mostly people in the very rural areas that had never seen any economic development. But after those sanctions, he kept saying, oh, no, we're making a comeback. We're keeping the economy going. Yeah, he was doing it just like Stalin was with the Ukraine, with the Holodomor, the mass starvation, in which he subdued the Ukrainian, farmers who were very productive when they were free to do their jobs. But, they weren't going to do that on the orders of a damn Russian. Well, actually, he's a Georgian, but that's another story. Stalin would never admit that. But his successor was a Ukrainian, Khrushchev. And he was very coy about that. I mean, it was considered a miracle that he survived as long as he did, working for Stalin. But and he never openly, basically said, yeah, we should treat the Ukrainians right. But he basically didn't do anything to crack down on Ukraine, because he already had a very, how should I put it, dark reputation for being. He was a Zampolit. He was a senior communist deputy to combat units. And that's why he rose in the political ranks. He basically did whatever he was told just to survive, which a lot of people in Russia did during the Cold War. Once they were free, the rules changed. Putin's trying to change them back, and he's not been very successful. So he's basically playing a losing game. The more he tries, the more trouble he gets into. And the ultimate trouble he gets into, if he sends troops into Ukraine, he'll find out Ukrainians are willing to fight. They don't take any local, heat from the population for dying defending Ukraine. They get praised for it. They get statues or whatever in the village square. But Russia, Putin, stirs up a rebellion in Russia if he starts losing a lot of conscript soldiers in Ukraine. That never gets reported. So Putin is a gambler who keeps losing, so he keeps doubling down. You know where that ends.
Well, Jim, the danger, to go back what I said, is doubling down, and then like Saddam doubling down. He finally makes a lurch move, and Putin could play that. Now, Dan, understand, this is total speculation. I'm not making a quote unquote prediction, but follow these elements and call it a projection. Is if that did happen, there really was a move. Putin could tout the fait accompli of whatever is occupied as a success. All of these other elements that Jim raises, though, are the things that would test that success. He's got to know that those are in play. The reason that I see this coming off now, not in the threat now, is they perceive the Biden administration as weak, and the Afghanistan debacle is certainly part of that. And he thinks he can get away with, and is getting away with, the propaganda bluster, the bold diplomatic moves, and the threats. And he at least thinks he gets something out of that, because Russians still admire tough Russian leaders, at least the image of a tough Russian leader. So,
yeah, but one thing Putin doesn't really understand was that the Democrats, because of the weak, American president after early 2020, has done more than just damage, foreign relations, but he's trashed the American economy.
Yeah,
he shut down a lot of the things that made United States energy independent for the first time in decades, lowered inflation, provided more jobs than had ever been seen in a long time, and that just poof, within 1 year. And this is reported, even in the pro-Democratic Party press, they try and reinterpret it, but his approval ratings are the lowest for any president ever.
Well, this is to put it in the strategic perspective. Putin sees weakness. He sees weakness, and he's going to try to take advantage of it. While that take advantage of that weakness as long as it persists.
But what he doesn't understand is the Democratic Party sees themselves losing power at the midterm elections this year. And, right now the numbers are showing, a total wipeout. And so the people who were urging, his advisors, as it were, who were, the Republicans say telling him what to do. Now they're telling him, look, you got to show some spine. You got to try and convince Putin that, you can be as badass as Trump. And he may not understand your motivation, but you definitely have it.
Well, we've got what two heavy brigades on alert now. I think it was 8,500 troops. Looks like it's about 10,000. But all right, close to 10,000.
Yeah, but alert doesn't mean much. I mean, that putting troops on alert is always been a PR gesture. What's important is the Ukrainians have organized and trained and are equipped basically to defend their country.
The other thing is that as this Poland, I'm going to step back for just a second. Poland really has an aggressive modernization program for its army, and that's going to come to fruition in 2 or 3 years. I mean, you're going to see the difference with at least 2 and slowly building up to 5 heavy divisions. I mean, heavy divisions along the line of the U.S. Army heavy divisions with highly upgraded Abrams. So, it's not going to be a Polish pushover. Not that it isn't now, but suddenly that Ukraine would be backed by a NATO member that's right on its border with a credible ground force. Anyway, just he's got to see that. He's got to see that coming.
But something else you have to understand, and he must see this, that Ukraine during the Soviet period was basically one of the centers of defense innovation, development, and construction. And they basically had the majority of the abandoned, as it were, no longer cruise for armored vehicles. Now, what the Ukrainians did was they turned that into an opportunity. They basically upgraded them. They offered them at cheap prices. They, like the Chinese, they would sell to anybody. If you can pay, we can ship. And when the Russians, threatened the Ukraine, they basically started doing that for themselves. And we've covered that in strategy page. All sorts of weapons that they have developed. Their troops are well armed, not with the same weapons that the Russians have. But remember, as the Israelis pointed out during the earliest Arab-Israeli wars, where the Arabs often had superior equipment, the Israelis pointed out it's not the quality of the weapons, it's the tenacity and determination of the people handling them. In fact, in later Arab-Israeli wars, where the Israelis had superior weapons, and somebody pointed out, well, you've got better weapons now. I says, yeah, but we could switch weapons with our enemies. We still defeat them. We take more losses, but they would lose. We have more incentives. So the Ukrainians are like the Israelis. They are faced with, the extermination as a nation. And they lost that for several hundred years, when the Muscovites came down and decided Ukraine, with its fertile farmlands and what have you, should belong to Russia. They tried to get out. They temporarily got out when the revolutionaries in Russia in 2016, they made peace with the Germans, and there was a Republic of Ukraine for a short while. Well, that didn't last. Once the war ended, the Reds came back in, and that was the end of that. But the Ukrainians never forgot that. They realized it was possible. Under the right circumstances, we can be independent and we can stay independent. And you look at what the Poles have done with NATO and with the Baltic states. The Baltic states have adapted very well to the situation they're in. They 5 or 6 years ago, they started issuing pamphlets. Every family in the country detailing the techniques, that proven techniques to handle the invaders or occupying Russians. And a lot of families, they don't, there's not anybody alive, but they have a grandparent or, some ancestor who passed down the oral tradition of how terrible these Russians are. Something else people don't realize, that a large proportion in some of these Baltic states were ethnic Russians after basically the liberation of the Baltic states. And at first, the Baltic states, the ethnic locals, they couldn't trust the Russians. But eventually they realized, once the Russians learned to speak the local language fluently, and you could talk to them, they didn't want to be ruled by Russia. They'd seen what happens in the West. They basically enjoyed the benefits of living in a democratic, Lithuania or whatever, and they're willing to fight to keep it. So the Russians lost that. The Russians deluded themselves into thinking wherever there are ethnic Russians, there are Russian patriots. Well, that's not true. You give them a taste of a good life, and they become locals.
Well, one of the other things too, though, is that we sit and talk about our vulnerabilities, or the Kaliningrad, which is the exclave, formerly Königsberg in Prussia, but it's part of Russia. It was guaranteed after the end of the Cold War. That's also something that Russia could lose if they really did ignite a war in Eastern Europe. I'm not sure who would absorb it, Lithuania, Poland, or whatever, but Moscow would lose it. It could lose it. And I know it's fortified. You've got all kinds of forces in there, but they're isolated. And, you're going to make an armored thrust through Belarus to relieve Kaliningrad. Maybe not if the U.S. Air Force is back in there. They're going to have a lot of destroyed Russian armored vehicles littering up Belarus. So I just pointed out, it's just a game. I just came up with a war game scenario. That's all.
Well, we've covered Kaliningrad several times.
Yeah, I know.
And that's another problem area for the Russians, because the people in Kaliningrad, they realize that they're living in the midst of affluence. Basically much less corrupt government, and I think if the Russians took a beating, PR beating as it were, with their failed attempt to scare the Ukrainians into surrendering again, the people in Kaliningrad, you wouldn't have to worry about Poland or Lithuania invading them. They really are less interested in
do it themselves. That's good. Yeah,
they say self-liberate. It was like the old Russian joke. Towards it was very popular towards the end of the Cold War, where the senior Soviet executive wants to show off to his grandmother, who grew up, through the Great War and what have you, all his goodies he's gotten. He's got Western cars, he's got Dashers, he's got summer homes, he's got several apartments downtown. He says, "Isn't it wonderful, Mother, what I've been able to do as a Soviet official?" And she looks at him and says, but Yuri, what if the Reds come back? So nobody wants the Reds to come back, including a lot of the Reds.
Right. Well, that's a good place to end. We'll continue to watch it and talk about it again, I'm sure. We'll see you next time.
Bye, guys.
Bye.